In the Defender, there's an article, "Why does the FDA get nearly half of its funding from the very companies that it regulates?" Now, when you look at that from a outside perspective, that sounds like a really bad idea. It seems like an enormous conflict of interest, and that's what we're going to discuss. But before we get started, I'm Dr. Nick Zarowski. Welcome to the channel. Be sure to subscribe and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're alerted when new videos are released on the most recent health news. And then also to get my full library of natural health videos, go to www.drzee.tv. Now, this article caught my eye because it was recently that one of the viewers of this channel brought to my attention that the FDA was actually funded by the people that is supposed to regulate. Now, you could just see how that could go wrong very quickly if the person that is paying you money is also the person that you're supposed to be regulating. And it seems like not so great of an idea. The Food and Drug Administration has moved from an entirely taxpayer-funded entity to one increasingly funded by the user fees paid by the manufacturers that are being regulated. Today, close to 45% of its budget comes from these user fees that companies pay when they apply for approval of a medical device or a drug. Now, when I initially saw this, I thought, well, this is a good thing because I don't believe that these government regulatory bodies should all be taxpayer funded. I think that some of them should be able to stand on their own two legs, and they should be able to do so by generating an income. Otherwise, if every time there's some government body and it has to be taxpayer funded, that's very burdensome to the taxpayer themselves. Whereas if they're able to generate their own income, that's a good thing. However, I don't know that the government body that is supposed to be determining whether something is safe I don't think it's a good thing necessarily for them to be paid by the company they're supposed to regulate. Now, of course, this is an interesting discussion, and I don't quite know where I am on this topic in general, but some of the data shows that it could be very risky. So let's start a conversation down below in the comments, but what do you think? Do you think that the FDA should be funded by the very companies that it's regulating, or do you think it should be taxpayer funded? It's an interesting conversation to have. I'm going to go down the article a little bit. We talk about, in this article, they talk about the FDA, they blocked thalidomide. And this was basically a very dangerous drug that was being used in 46 countries, allowed to pregnant women to treat morning sickness. The FDA refused it in the United States based on the grounds that the studies were insufficient to demonstrate safety. Well, there was debilitating birth defects that came from this, and so it was a big deal for the FDA when they blocked that because, hey, they showed that it actually worked. Now, through the years, the funding has been changed, and there was just funding issues to the FDA, so they thought, well, this would be a better way to have it funded properly. The article goes on to say, over time, other user fees for generic, over-the-counter, biosimilar, animal, and animal generic drugs, as well as for medical devices were created. At the time past, the FDA's funding has increasingly come from industries that regulate it. Of the FDA's total U.S. $5.9 billion budget. That is an insane budget, by the way, $5.9 billion. 45% of it comes from user fees, but 65% of the funding for human drug regulatory activities are derived from the user fees. These user fee programs must be reauthorized every 5 years by the Congress, and the current agreement remains in effect to September 2022. Now, I'm going to go down a little bit here because it goes in a little bit as to why this could be a potential problem. Because of the additional funding generated by user fees and performance measures, and this is important too, performance measures. Pay attention to that little part there that the FDA has to meet. The FDA is quicker and more willing to discuss what it wants to see in an application with the manufacturer. So basically the manufacturers can go to the FDA and they're like, hey, look, this is what you got to do to pass. This is what you got to do to pass your drug through. It also offers clearer guidance for the manufacturers. In 1987, it took 29 months from the time a new drug application was filed by the manufacturer for the FDA to decide whether to approve a medication in the US. And in 2014, it only took 13 months. And by 2018, it was down to 10 months, okay? So my initial thought when seeing this is, well, they have probably, look, they got a budget of all those billions of dollars. They probably become very, very good at what they're doing. They're very efficient, right? Well, let's go on to read and see what this article has to say. Changes in more recent years have also increased the number of standard new drug applications approved in the first time around by the FDA, from 38% in 2005 to 61% in 2018. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean they became more efficient, right? Basically, what it sounds like they're doing is they're just allowing stuff to pass through. I mean, that is a big approval jump from 2005 to 2018. In diseases where there are not as many medication options for patients, the FDA has a priority review process where 89% of the new drug applications were approved the first time around, and the approvals were completed in 8 months in 2018. So basically, like I said, they're going, oh, market needs this medication, let's just shove it through. So all of this occurred while the number of new drug applications have been increasing over time. So that basically means they're reviewing them less, they're doing less of their own homework on it to make sure it's safe, and they're pushing it through, okay? Now, most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has seen the FDA provide emergency use authorization for potential treatments in a matter of weeks, not months. The infrastructure and the capacity to review the available information so rapidly is due in large part due to the funding from the user fees. Now, this is something that's kind of interesting because a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the stuff out there for the COVID-19 pandemic is being approved under emergency use authorization. So this basically means that it was not approved in the way where they found it to be safe and effective and it would never cause problems in people. They're just going like, yeah, we need to shove it through. So they looked at it, it seemed pretty good, so they put it on through. So when we look at a lot of these treatments for the COVID-19, they are not actually FDA approved. They're allowed for emergency use, basically. While the number and speed of drug approvals has been increasing over time, so have the number of drugs that end up having serious safety issues coming to light after the FDA approval. Okay, so as we mentioned before, they're just shoving stuff through. They're not actually doing their homework on it. In one assessment, investigators looked at the number of newly approved medications that were subsequently removed from the market or had to include a new black box warning over 16 years from the year of approval. These black box warnings are the highest level of safety alert that the FDA can employ, warning users that a very serious adverse event could occur. Okay, so I'm all for a lot of things that are things that are going to be very beneficial to people to not get caught up in the FDA and not be allowed for use. However, it's also important to make sure that they're doing their due diligence and doing their job, and they're sufficiently looking at the evidence to determine if these things are safe. And what they're saying is they're pushing them through, and guess what? There's more and more issues coming from the very products that they say are fine. But then we go back to the original question. Is it good for them to be generating their income from the user fees? Because therefore, when we look at it this way, the more that they shove through, the more that they approve, the more user fees they get. And then they're also doing better on their performance rating. Before the User Fee Act was approved, 21% of medications were removed or had new black box warnings compared to the 27% after. Some potential reasons that more adverse effects are coming to light after drug approvals include senior FDA officials overturning scientists' recommendations, a lower burden of proof for medication approval, and more clinical data in new drug applications coming from foreign clinical trial sites that require additional time to assess in an environment where regulators are rushing to meet tight deadlines. So this is obviously quite an issue, okay? Now we have to go further into this article, and they talk about without careful consideration of what is being negotiated, the FDA can become weak and ineffective, unable to protect its citizens from the next thalidomide, which was the dangerous drug that was approved in so many countries, but protected and kept away from U.S. citizens due to the FDA. There are some signs that the pendulum may be swinging too far in the direction of the manufacturer. Additionally, while drug approval functions at the FDA are well funded. The FDA is insufficiently funded to protect consumers from other issues such as counterfeit drugs and dietary supplements because they cannot collect their user fees to do so. In my view, these functions need to be identified and require additional taxpayer funding. And I have to agree with the view of the individual who wrote this article, because maybe there could be a balance. There could be a certain level of funding that comes from the user fees, but there also has to be a certain level of funding that comes from the government, because otherwise you just end up in this pay-to-play operation. I mean, these drug companies who have endless amounts of money, just flush with cash, they can go to the FDA and end up getting whatever they want if they put enough money towards it. And when you look at, I mean, okay, I do a lot of nutritional supplementation. I mean, a lot of the stuff out there in the market is garbage, and it's actually something that is quite frustrating for us, because as we look at creating very, very high quality products that are very much investigated for all types of toxicity, and making sure that we do our due diligence to make sure that the best of quality coming from good sources, without pesticides, without herbicides, without all these different chemicals on them, heavy metals, and coming from good sources, not from some dingy place in China. It costs a lot of money to do so, but that's what we need for a clinically grade in pharmaceutical grade product. Whereas we have so many dietary supplements that are being sold on like Amazon, and they're just garbage, and they're half the price, so people go for them. Which, I mean, I don't particularly blame them if they don't know any better, but it's definitely something to think about. So overall, I guess I'm going to look in the comments below and see what your thoughts are on this. But yeah, certainly a problem with the FDA being funded by the very companies that that is supposed to be regulating. It's just not a good thing. We have to make sure that we are always being protected by these government bodies, and a lot of times they're just doing a lot of the bidding for these big pharmaceutical companies. They're allowing things to be passed that shouldn't be passed just because the companies are throwing enough money at them. And then, of course, like I said, it opens the door for a lot of fraudulent activity. So give this video a thumbs up, and also check out my other videos on this channel that'll help you stay well informed in the news cycle as it pertains to health.